Dear students, today we'll quickly look at the text Epitaph by Katherine Philips. This is a poem that she had written in honor of her son's late memory, and she dedicates it to H.P. HP stands for Henry Hector Philip, right? And he was only 40 days old. In fact, many critiques wonder if he, in fact, was 40 days old because in order to allow for a rhyme scheme is why she says 40 days. So, Catherine Phillips is a well known British female poet. She has contributed tremendously to poetic literature, and she's oftentimes also compared to further writers much later on to Sylvia Plath, etc. She has written almost 125 poems. Much of it is to do with themes of family, motherhood, relationships, all of which were very personal in nature. But sadly, she also died at a very young age, and she was also buried next to her son, Hector Phillips. Right now, the poem Epitaph is a deeply sorrowful poem. It is a poem of trying to attain a sense of closure after the very traumatic loss of her son. Right, and this son, as mentioned in the poem, was granted to the couple after almost 7 years of marriage. So this goes on to show the kind of absolute joy, absolute jubilance and a blessing this would have been, but how cruelly and how easily it was ripped away from her, taken away from her. So the poem essentially starts off with her lamenting, with her questioning and challenging the very unfair turn of events. And again, Catherine Phillips was somebody that deeply trusted in God, uses her faith as a form of strength. So it starts off with a form of, a very accusatory tone where she questions God of how he could so easily take away her happiness, her purpose, her meaning in life. But as the poem progresses, there is a sense of closure at the end where she accepts the fate of her son, and she accepts that he is a form of blessing that is, of course, short lived, but he essentially resides in a place that is heavenly, holy, and in a better place. So it's a beautiful journey that the poem takes. Right? Now, an epitaph essentially is a short lyric which is written in memory of someone who has died. So oftentimes it's written either by a close family member, a friend, and sometimes epitaphs are also written by the person themselves before their death. Right? For example, Shakespeare himself has penned his own epitaph. Right now, epitaphs, of course, are deeply emotional in nature. It captures the essence of the life, about their joys, their contributions, what kind of a person were they, how did they help the others, right? So epitaph essentially is a very personal note of farewell of sorts, of remembrance of sorts. Right now, the poem, we'll quickly dive into the themes, right? So, the poem essentially deals with sorrow and the tragedy of death, especially maternal grief. You see, through this form of writing, through her poetry, there is a form of closure which is attained. You see, the loss of a dear one is a form of pain that can truly never be understood, that can truly never be overcome, right? That you can never overcome from, right? But at least through this form of writing, there is a form of healing. And especially for women back in the day, especially in the 1800s, it such spaces become a form of liberating that form of emotion. So it essentially is a poem about sorrow, about maternal grief, about the loss of a child for parents and how they have to endure it. It talks about the very unfair, cruel nature of death as something, as a metaphor for the kind of injustice that is inflicted upon the parent, right? Death is a universal truth. It's a transient nature of life, an inescapable, an irrefutable part of life that has to be accepted. That is why the poem starts off with this form of rejection, but it ends with a sense of acceptance. Because in the beginning, if you observe, she starts with metaphors of sand and dust, all of it to indicate a sense of transience in life, that nothing can be trusted in life, right? But towards the end, there is a form of acceptance of the truth in life, right? It also dives into the stages of grief, denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and it very beautifully traces these multiple stages that the mother has to go through. Right? And finally, as I'd mentioned earlier, she finds strength in her faith, in her religion, and it is her faith that essentially allows her to grow past, move past this very traumatic experience. And it also looks at fears of pregnancy and the paradox of birth. You see, it's essentially a mother that celebrates the birth of her son after 7 years. There's such wonder, there's such joy, such beauty, but how all of it so quickly is packaged into a form of mourning and sorrow with the death of the son. So it's a very paradoxical nature that is also examined here. And like I had mentioned, the process of writing, it becomes a process of mourning and a process of moving on, right? So, and again, it's essentially a eulogy as well, pattern of praise, lament, and comfort, right? So she essentially, the poem is a dedication to her son. It honors his beauty, his wonder, the kind of happiness that the son brought through. But this form of dedication also allows her to comfort herself, that at least in the memory of her son, she was a mother for a brief moment, and that is enough for her to carry forward, right? And so it's essentially it's a beautiful poem that tracks down these very painful, intense themes. But Catherine Phillips does a wonderful job at replaying this. And again, given the fact that this is a personal trauma, her writings become not just, especially this poem, Epitaph, becomes not just a personal note of closure, but it also becomes, in one sense, a collective rendition of trauma. You see, countless women, especially in the 1800s, because of, the infant mortality rate was extremely high, and the lack of medical facilities, etc. This was a very common occurrence of losing a child at a young age. So her poetry here becomes not just a personal note of sorrow and of closure, but it becomes a collective rendition of the experience of trauma. Right. So these are few of the themes that you can highlight. With that, we shall end the lecture for now.